Hey guys, in this episode I'm going to talk about debugging a Blazor WebAssembly application. So when we talk about debugging a traditional ASP.NET web application or even a Blazor server application, your code is running on the server. Your fully featured .NET runtime is running on the server. So attaching the debugger to the process which is running your web application to the IDE, to the debugger, it's an easier task, or I should say this has been done before. But in the case of Blazor WebAssembly application, you're compiling your code and pushing it on the browser. Even your .NET runtime is running on the browser, your Razor components are running in the browser. So attaching these WebAssemblies which are running in the browser to the IDE which is running on the server to debug your code is a difficult task. It gets trickier when you are running your Blazor WebAssembly application as hosted. That means your Blazor WebAssembly application has a backend which is running on a server. So debugging the client application at the same time debugging server application gets a little difficult. To enable debugging, what you need to do in your application, you need to add this inspectUri line in your launchSettings.json file. You'll find this file in your client and server project both so that you can debug both the applications. This inspect.uri line enables the IDE to detect the application is a Blazor WebAssembly application, and it also instructs the script debugging infrastructure to connect to the browser through Blazor's debugging proxy. Okay, so in this episode, what we're going to do, we are going to debug our application through Visual Studio Code, and then we'll debug in the browser, and then towards the end, we'll debug our application in Visual Studio. So let's jump into Visual Studio Code first and see if we can debug our application there or not. For that, I'm going to open my Visual Studio Code, and to run your application, your Blazing Chat application in debugging mode, you can just press F5, or you can go to your run menu and just say start debugging. If you're running this for the first time, this might take a little bit of time, but eventually the application runs and you should be able to debug your application in the browser. So you can see that Blazing Chat application is loading, and you can see I can navigate to my pages, profile, contacts, and setting in my Blazor application, which is running in debugging mode. Okay, so if I let's try to debug this click me button. So if I go to my settings page, which is not counter anymore, if I go to my settings page, and I'm going to put a debugger here and go back to my browser and click on click me. So once I click on click me, you can see that it is stopping here, and I can hover over this variable and see what the value is. It's 0 right now. I can continue, and that will take me back to the browser, which is incrementing the count. If I click on this again, I can hover over it again and see the value is 1 now. And if I press F10, which will take me to the next line. If I press F11, if you're in a if you're on a function, you can get into the function that we'll talk about. But I can go to the next line like this and check the value again and see the increment count is incrementing the count of current count. Okay, so I'm gonna press F5 here. Let's try to debug our contacts page. So if I go to my contacts page, what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a debugger after loading forecast and before loading contact list. So I'm going to put a debugger here. I'll put a debugger here, and then go to settings page, and then this is running on initialize. So if once I move to this file, once I click on contacts, it should hit this debugger, and you can see that it hit the debugger. And if I hover over forecast, it is showing the 5 random weather forecast which is getting pulled from the server. And you can open this object and see date, summary, temperature in Celsius, and temperature in Fahrenheit. And you can see right now the contact list has 0 items. The size is 0, and there is nothing in it. But if I press F10, it will go to the next line. If I hover over it again, you can see the size increases, and I can open the contact, and you can see the contact ID, Julius Caesar, last name is Caesar, and all that. You can also step into the code by pressing F11. So if I press F11, it's gonna add the contact from the constructor, and you can see that it's going to the contacts page and the constructor. And if you want to get out of it, then you can press step out, and that will bring you back to the contacts page. Okay, so I'm gonna press F5 here and go back to my browser, and you can see that our page is getting loaded with the contacts. Okay, so it's not that you can just debug your client application, you can also debug your server application. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put a breakpoint here on weather forecast and go to weather forecast controller. So let's go to the server, and I'm going to go to the controller and put a breakpoint here where we are getting the weather. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my browser and go to settings page, and again go to navigate to contacts page, and then you can see that it's hitting that forecast which is null right now. It hasn't loaded yet, and if I press F5, then it will go to the server application, and you can debug your server application here too. You can press F10 and step through the code in your server application too. And if I press F5 here, again, it will come back to the contacts page where it was debugging contact list. And if I press F5, this also works fine, and my contacts is getting loaded. One thing that I noticed here is there are some limitations, I should say. So if I just want to debug an async function, if I want to step over through this async function, it doesn't let me do that. Let's say if I remove this breakpoint, and the only breakpoint that I have is on my contacts page, this weather forecast, and if I go to my browser and go to settings and go to contacts page, it hits the debugger, which is trying to call an async function. And if I step over it, if I press F10, then I don't know what's happening, so that is something which was weird. If anyone finds this weird, or if they have any solution for that, let me know in the comment section. But if I go to settings page, then it goes to this this function toggle menu, and then I can run my application again. But I cannot step over an async function. That's something that I found. Let's say you are new to Blazor, and you're coming from a if you're coming from a JavaScript framework world where you worked on Angular, React.js, Vue.js, and you have the habit of writing console.log to inspect your items. That's something that you can do too. So if you can say that, you can say console.writeLine, and let's see if I want to inspect the third item in my contact list, I can say contact list, the second index, and I want to write the first name of the person which is third in the list. And in this case, you don't really have to debug your application too. You can just run your application. Let's move to the server folder. I'm gonna go to server folder and say .NET run, which will run my application. And you should be able to see this line in your browser in your console. So when you run the application, I'll go to that link. I'll go to that link, and it will open up my it should open up my browser. I'm just going to copy this. Sometimes it doesn't work. I'm going to go to my browser and run my Blazing chat application. And if I go to my contacts page, let's open our developer tool here again. In console, if I go to contacts page, you can see that this Gary is getting printed in the console. So if you're coming from a JavaScript framework world, and if you don't really want to debug like I just did, you can also debug your application this way too. Okay. One another limitation that I found was you can't if you're running your application in debug mode, then it doesn't hit the breakpoint as a breakpoint if it finds an exception. So let's say that I want to, I'm going to throw an exception here for, intentionally throw an exception, say that contact list dot count, and I'm going to divide this by 0. Let's divide this by 0, and this should throw an error. So if you're debugging a Blazor server application, or if you're debugging another ASP.NET web application, your debugger will stop here and throw a breakpoint saying that this looks like a problem. But if you're doing that in Blazor Blazor WebAssembly application, then debugger doesn't hit a breakpoint here. It will directly show log information in the browser that this is where the problem is happening, but it doesn't stop there to tell you like this line of code is a problem. That's something that they're working on. Hopefully they will release that pretty soon. But I'm running my application in debugger mode again, and if I go to my contacts page, you can see that it's throwing an exception. It's throwing an error, but it's not it's not stopping here. The debugger is not stopping here and saying that, okay, this is where the problem is. You'll have to press F12 and go to console, and then you can see that this is attempted to divide by 0, and divide by 0 exception is happening on this line, which is not bad. You can go to that line and fix your code. So yeah, that's all about debugging through debugging your Blazor WebAssembly application through VS Code. Now let's talk about what all things do you need to debug your application. So the very first thing that you're going to need is you gotta go to your launch settings file, which you will find in client and server project. So I'm going to go to my client project and go to properties, and you can see this launchSettings.json file. You should add this inspectUri line, which connects to the browser through Blazor's web debugging proxy. So you need to add this line. This is the first thing that you should do, and you should also add that line in your server project. So you can go to your properties, and on your launch settings you can add that line in your server project to inspectUri. Okay. The second thing that you should do, or make sure that your C# extension is up to date, and excuse me, and you have also installed JavaScript debugger, which is nightly right now. Hopefully they will release a proper version of it, a lifetime support version or general availability version, whatever they want to call. This is currently in preview right now, but you should install this extension, and you should enable debug JavaScript preview, use preview to true setting, and you can do that by, you just can copy that, go to your settings and look for that setting and just turn on this, and then your extensions are up to date and you are using your JavaScript debugger in preview mode. Okay, so yeah, so you should make sure that is happening. And the third thing that you need to make sure that you have proper launch.json file, and it should look something like this. So in this file, you can see that the name is launch and debug hosted Blazor WebAssembly application. The type is Blazor WASM. You are launching this. You can also attach the process. We'll talk about that in some other episode, but it is you need this configuration, which is hosted, which program you should run. It's debugger, debug, and Blazing chat server application. This is the working directory. So you should have this launch.json file in your VS Code in order to run your application in debug mode. Let's say your launch.json is looking a little different. You created your application when Blazor WebAssembly was in preview mode, and your launch.json is looking a little different, or you don't have this launch.json. Let's assume that. So the one way you can add this file is just, I'm going to delete this folder. And then close my VS Code, and then reopen my VS Code. Then VS Code will detect that you need additional assets to run your application, run and debug your application, and it will throw a pop-up here which will ask us that you want to add these assets in your working directory in your folder structure to enable your VS Code to debug and run your application. It takes a little bit of time to detect that, but you can see that required assets to build and debug are missing from episode 5. Do you want to add them? And I'm going to click on yes, and it will ask me which project that I want to add it for, or which project should I run it for. And I want to run my server project because I want to debug both server and client project. Once I add that, then you can see that it adds this VS Code folder, and if I can go to my VS Code, and you can see the launch file which is added again in my folder here, and I should be able to excuse me, I should be able to run my Blazor WebAssembly application just like I did before. Okay. All right, so this is how you can debug your application in VS Code. Now I want to talk about one thing that I forgot to mention is you'll have to run your application. Let's run this again. You have to run your application in it should be secure connection. You should run your application as HTTPS, and then only you can debug, otherwise it won't work. And let's say you are seeing this is not authorized or this is not secure, you're seeing that, then you can go to this blog which tells you to you're seeing the not secure here, which tells you how to add the certificate. You have to run this command .NET dev certs HTTPS trust. If you add that, then once you install the certificate, then you should be able to run your application as secure application. And then you should be able to debug your application through VS Code. Okay, now I want to talk about how you can debug your application in the browser. Okay, for that I'm gonna go to my VS Code, and the first thing that I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go to my contacts page and comment this code because I don't want to throw an exception here. And let's then go to terminal, and here I want my application to run with debug configuration. For that, I'm gonna go to my server application, and then I'm gonna say that run this application with debug configuration. And I'm gonna click on this link. Hopefully that'll open. Yeah, that opened this time. And this is running just like it was running before. So I'm gonna press F12, and that'll open my console. And here you can see that we have these instructions which is like Shift Alt D when application has focus. So I'm gonna put a focus on the application and press the Shift Alt D. This will open another tab which will tell us if we could debug here if the Chrome browser, the Chrome instance that we're running is running with remote debugging enabled. So you can see that it's saying that unable to find debuggable browser tab. And if you want to run your Chrome with remote debugging enabled, you can run this command in your run command, and that will open up another Chrome window which will have remote debugging enabled, and you can debug your Blazor WebAssembly application there. So I'm gonna copy this. Let's copy this, and then I'm gonna press Windows R, which will open up a window like this. I'm gonna paste that command and click on OK. Once I click on OK, that will open another window of Chrome, another instance of Chrome which has remote debugging enabled. So if I press F12 now and it's telling us the same instruction, you should have the focus on the application and press Shift Alt D to debug your application. So I'm going to press Shift Alt D, and this time it will open Developer Tools. In Developer Tools, if I you can see that it opened contact.razor, which is C# code. There's HTML code and there's C# code which we can debug through. It also has settings.razor file, and you can find more files in this file. You can go to client and see these all pages, and you can debug through these pages. So if I go to settings page and put a debugger here and go back to my Blazing chat and press on click me, then you can see that it hits a debugger, it hits a breakpoint, in which if I come back to developer tool, I can hover over this and see the value of current count. To continue in the browser, the shortcut is F8, it's not F5, so just remember that. And then the other shortcuts are the same: to step into, step over. Let's try to debug our initialize function on contacts page. So I'm gonna go to my Blazing chat again, and I'm gonna go to contacts page. It'll hit a breakpoint again, and you can see that it's trying to debug our weather forecast call, and it's also debugging through our C# code, which is adding some contacts. So if I hover over this, you can see weather forecast, and if I hover over contact list, you can see that I can go through these items which are our contacts. Awesome, right? So that's how you can debug your application in the browser. Now I want to talk about how you can debug your application in Visual Studio. So the last thing that I want to talk about is how you can debug your application in Visual Studio. Okay. For that, let's first go to our VS Code and stop this because I don't want it to throw errors. And then I'm gonna go to my Visual Studio, and debugging in Visual Studio is very simple experience, very easy experience. Just make sure that you have in your properties, in launch settings, you have this inspectUri line mentioned in your client and your server project, and then you should be able to debug your application just like debugging any other application. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to my contacts page and put a breakpoint here. And then make sure that you have in debug mode here any CPU, Blazor server application, and I'm going to press IS Express, and which will open up my browser. And if I go to contacts page, it will hit my breakpoint here, and the keys are same, the shortcuts are same like any other application. You still can't step over an async function. That's something that I observed and I wanted to share with you guys. But if I go to some other page, let's go to some other page, settings page, then it'll hit that toggle menu again. You can press continue. You can go to contacts page again. If I press F8, F10 here again, then it goes to you should have a breakpoint next line after calling this async function, then it works. So you can see that it works just fine. So debugging in Visual Studio is very easy experience. But yeah, will not be using Visual Studio, we'll be using VS Code for the series. Okay. All right, so that's all about debugging a Blazor WebAssembly applications. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me on Twitter or Facebook. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Bye.